Well, Pierce, I can only say this, and I've been saying this consistently over the past 25, 30 years that I've been in the know on this. And that is, I heard my entire life from 1963 on that the mob was involved in this hit. I've heard it from the right kind of people. There's no question that everybody in that life hated the Kennedys, specifically Robert Kennedy and Joe Kennedy, because a deal was cut during the presidential election with Kennedy and Nixon that the White House, the Department of Justice would lay off of the mob, and Robert Kennedy did just the opposite. And from what I was told, somebody in government, I don't know who it was, most likely I would say the CIA, since this would have been the third time that the CIA approached the mob for help. They did it in World War II. They did it again when they wanted to assassinate Castro. These are facts. They came again, and for some reason, Lee Harvey Oswald needed to be silenced, and they came to us, and we were more than happy to oblige them in that regard. Jack Ruby, who 100% was a mob associate, going back to the days of Capone and Accardo in Chicago, and then Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, and also his connections in Dallas. He was the one designated to silence Oswald. I've heard that consistently my whole life from the right people in the know. There's no reason for them to brag about this. Normally, they wouldn't say anything when they're involved in a hit. But I've heard this from my father, who was the underboss at that time, to Joe Colombo and to others involved. There was consistent knowledge within our life. So, and I said this before, Pierce, if they try to downplay Jack Ruby's role and say that he wasn't associated with the mob in any of these confidential classified documents, then I wouldn't believe much of what's stated in there, because he 100% was, and that was common knowledge.
Well, before I go to Jefferson there, just to respond to that, on that specific point about his shooting capability, I imagine you're fairly proficient with firearms, Michael. To actually shoot somebody in a moving car from where Lee Harvey Oswald was, I would imagine takes a pretty high level of proficiency. So would you think it's significant, if the Russians have been watching him, that his target practice was way off?
Yeah, I think.
I would think.
Sorry, that was for Michael Franseze. I'll come back to you, Mike. One second.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree with that. You have to be very proficient to shoot somebody, to shoot a moving target like that. So I think that's a correct observation.
Okay, Mike, you wanted to say something on that?
Yeah, look, first of all, I think I may be mistaken on this. I think Oswald had his marksman badge, which, you can either, consider important or not, depending on the qualification standards that you set. But I've been down there and spent a fair amount of time at the plaza and up in the book depository looking and recreating that shot. It's not a difficult shot. I've talked about this before. You had, the wind was not a factor. It was a very clear day. He'd recce'd the site well before the vehicle's moving in line with you. It's an open top vehicle. From a shooter's perspective, that's not a tough shot. Again, I'm not drawing any conclusions from it. I'm just saying from an operational perspective, not a difficult shot.
Okay, Jefferson, on the mob point that Mike has been very steadfast about this, that clearly it was openly known and discussed in mob circles that Jack Ruby was acting on their behalf, and this was a revenge against Bobby Kennedy, who had basically, in their eyes, betrayed them. Is there anything that you've seen so far in the files concerning the mob generally?
I have not searched for organized crime. One of the problems is that the archives did not make these documents searchable. So you really have to go through them one by one. And I have not seen organized crime material in there. But I think Michael's absolutely right that that is the organized crime component of Kennedy's assassination, the elimination of the chief witness. I want to go back to one thing, though, that that John said before. We talk about this atmosphere. What we've learned over the years is that the story of a lone gunman, some crazy guy who came out of nowhere and no one knew anything about him, that's just not true. Okay. And when I say Angleton recruited Oswald as a source or contact, that's not an inference of mine. I'm quoting from a document where Angleton describes what was the criteria for putting somebody on his mail surveillance program. And he says in this newly declassified document, the sole purpose was to see if that person could be recruited as a source or contact. So that shows that the most likely explanation for Angleton taking an interest in Oswald in 1959 was to recruit him as a source or contact. And the fact that he then maintained surveillance of Oswald for the next 4 years supports that. So, what was going on here? Angleton was running a counterintelligence operation involving Oswald. And I think that's what we're going to learn if we get all of the JFK documents. He wasn't just watching him and being incompetent. He was running an operation and being very competent, because that operation is still secret.
There are lots of other CIA-related bits and pieces throughout the files. One of them is a CIA memo describing Oswald phoning the Soviet embassy asking for a visa while in Mexico City in late September.
All right, guys. Again, this is Piers Morgan, so they're gonna dance around the issue. This James Angleton guy, right, who was the CIA officer who served as chief of the counterintelligence department. A lot of the files that were redacted were showing how this guy Angleton had, there's documents that show that there is a link between the CIA, Angleton, the Israeli Mossad, and their nuclear transfer program that was operating behind JFK's back at the time. And JFK also ordered on-site inspections of the Dimona nuclear facility, right? And it was in tandem with, they used the mob, essentially, and people domestically who were against Kennedy, right, to get rid of JFK. But they facilitated, again, these are never going to be released because it's literally going to expose our greatest ally here. Essentially, they use these people, Oswald, Rubinstein, the mob, right, to take out JFK, and they provided the intelligence. And so it's all tied in, but of course, they're not going to talk about that on Piers Morgan. Even the guy Angleton is actually buried now in occupied Palestine. This guy's revered. A lot of interesting things, but yeah, Jack Rubinstein, Ruby, was involved. The mob was involved. They all had special interest in taking out JFK, right? But again, I guess we're gonna have to wait another 100 years until they really. They probably shredded all those documents, guys. It's all in the wind, Let me know what you guys think about this clip here, man.